Hey everybody, welcome to the New York Ghost Story Festival. This is the soft start. We're going to be starting the program in just a few minutes. I'm going to allow some time for everybody to join in. I'm here with Lee Thomas and Douglas Wynne. Hey guys.
Hey Dan.
Hello.
Yeah, so we're going to just hang out for a little bit, allow people to come to the room, and we're just going to wait for Sarah to join us. I'm going to help her come on in.
Cool.
So don't mind me as I type. Sorry about that, guys. I'm just helping Sarah get into the room here.
Sure thing.
So we were just we'll start in just a minute. We was chatting with Lee about cool ghost story book. We'll talk a little more about it later. Talking about Julia. Have you seen this one, Doug, or seen the movie?
You know, it's funny that exact paperback in your hand is the one I read in high school, but it's been a very long time.
Me too. I have my shiny paperbacks.
Yeah, cool cover.
Oh my! And here's Sarah. Hey, Sarah.
She is. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Sarah's with us. I messed up, and I think I sent her the wrong link, and I sent God knows where I sent her off into digital land. So thanks so much that Sarah's here. I'm going to run our introductory video and be right back with Lee Thomas, Sarah Langan, and Douglas Wynne. Hey everybody, welcome to the New York Ghost Story Festival, an annual event of ghost story readings and discussion featuring authors of uncanny, strange, and fantastic from New York and from around the globe. I'm just working on the mics here for a second. My name is Daniel Braum. I'm the founder of the event and your host. I'm an author of Strange Tales. My most recent book of them is Underworld Dreams. This is the first year of our festival, and welcome to the second night. This year, due to COVID, we are going to be online only, but we'll be back in 2021, and I hope it'll be a mix of in-person and online events. In just a minute, I'm going to be introducing Sarah Langan, Lee Thomas, and Douglas Wynne. Just wanted to make a couple of opening remarks before we start the show. The reason for this event, there's a long tradition of telling ghost stories during Christmas time and during the dark days of December. The ghost story has a long literary lineage and history, and over the 6 nights of this festival, we're going to explore some of the early ghost stories and classics. We'll talk about authors who moved the ghost story forward and expanded what the ghost story could be through time, and we'll even get to hear some new favorites in modern ghost stories written right up until today. We had a great start. We heard from Rudy Dorman, Gwendolyn Keist, and Hyssop Malero, a range of ghost stories. Tonight, we're going to hear a nice range of them as well. We're going to hear some M.R. James, Richard Matheson, and even some real recent stuff. The full festival dates are tonight, coming back Monday, December 14th, December 19th at 7 p.m. On Sunday, December 20th, we're in the afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're going to wrap it up on Christmas Eve, December 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the closing of the event. The festival is not for profit. It's educational and artistic only. We have a Ko-Fi account. I believe that is kofi.com/nighttime logic. Donations will go towards our subscription, production, and advertising costs. The other bit I want to mention is I've asked all the authors in the festival to name a indie or local bookstore, so I'll be sharing that. If you hear something we're talking about or one of the stories that are being read, you could check them out first. So let's get to the ghost stories. A couple of remarks first. The telling or reading of ghost stories during long, dark, and cold Christmas nights is a Yuletide ritual which dates to at least the 18th century and was once as much a part of the Christmas traditions decorating fir trees, feasting on goose, and the singing of carols. During the Victorian era, many magazines printed ghost stories specifically for the Christmas season. These winter tales did not necessarily explore Christmas themes in any manner. Rather, they were offered as an eerie pleasure to be enjoyed on Christmas Eve with the family, adding a supernatural shiver to the seasonal chill. The tradition remained strong in the British Isles and her colonies throughout much of the 20th century, though in recent years it has been on the wane. But it is not on the wane tonight. I'm going to read. Last night I read a little bit of what Robert Aikman had to say in Ghost Stories. Just a couple of words on editor Larry Dark has a different take on the ghost story. He says, fiction in general and ghost stories in particular are similarly inspired by the need for psychic satisfaction. In dreams and literary fiction, the unfulfilled wish is usually transformed by symbols and metaphors. Ghosts, powerful symbols themselves, allow the writer to state the unfulfilled wish or unmet need overtly. Through their agency, wrongs are righted, broken trajectories completed, and justice of a sort achieved. The literary ghost can be frightening, engrossing, clever, ironic, mysterious, funny, or any of these, but at its best, it can also be immensely satisfying to our mortal souls and their yearning for completion. So I'm here. I'm going to unmute everybody's mic and say hello to Lee Thomas, Douglas Wynne, and Sarah Langan. How's everybody doing?
Doing great.
Hello. Good to be here, Dan.
Great to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. Lee Thomas is here. Lee Thomas is the Bram Stoker Award and two-time Lambda Literary Award-winning author. Lee lives in Austin, Texas with his husband, John. Douglas Wynne is here. He's the author of several novels, including The Devil of Echo Lake and the Spectra Files trilogy. He lives in Massachusetts with his wife and son and a house full of animals. And Sarah Langan is here, the award-winning author of 4 novels and lots of short stories. She works in both film and prose and lives in LA with her husband, daughters, and a very bad rabbit. Hey, everybody. So first up is Lee Thomas. And Lee is, as I'm going to read his full biography here, Lee is the Bram Stoker Award and two-time Lambda Literary Award-winning author of the books Stained, The Dust of Wonderland, The German, Torn, like Light for Flies, Down on Your Knees, and Distortion, among others. His work has been translated into multiple languages and has been optioned for film. Lee lives in Austin, Texas with his husband, John. Lee, you've written a bunch of ghost stories, including The Grief Season, from Unspeakable Horror 2, Nothing Forgiven, from Darkness on the Edge, from PS Publishing, and most recently Whimper Beg from Echoes, the saga book of ghost stories edited by Ellen Datlow. Why is the ghost story appealing to you as a writer?
Well, honestly, I think you probably just covered every ghost story I've written. With those few, what I love about ghost stories as a writer and a reader, primarily reader, it's so much about the backstory, about where that ghost came from, what had happened. All of that is just very interesting, I think. And when it's done well, as it is in a number of pieces, The Changeling, the film The Changeling, I think it has this phenomenal backstory involved with it. And, Julia, the Peter Straub novel, there are just a number of things that are intriguing about that. The action that's going on, at the time is also very good, but there's also the ambiguity of it. Are you just dealing with an unreliable narrator, or are you dealing with something supernatural? And usually by the time you find out that you really are dealing with something supernatural, you're really engaged with everything that's going on in the real world.
Yeah, it's a really cool way of looking at it. I never really thought of it as how important the backstory is to the ghost story, which makes perfect sense because, but just by its nature, the ghost, right, the ghost is almost all backstory. It's almost like the backstory that won't let go. And you also mentioned, why it's so intriguing in that there's ambiguity, perhaps, or tension as to either like the delivery of that backstory or just what the significance of that backstory means. Speaking of backstory, you're going to be reading a little bit later on from one of the classics. You're going to be reading something from M.R. James, but another M.R. James story that I'm glad you brought up. You brought up "Oh Whistle" and "I'll Come to You, My Lad." And I want to just talk about him for a moment. Of course, the great M.R. James, 1862 to 1936, so associated with Christmas, so associated with the ghost story, because he read his stories at Christmas to students at King's College, where he was a provost. James's ghosts were not the. Oh, sorry if I'm echoing here. Cambridge. He read his stories where he was in Cambridge, where he was provost, and his ghosts were not the moaning, chain rattling apparitions of Charles Dickens who had come before him. And he wasn't. They didn't even give us like the shrouded Gothic wraiths. His ghosts were weird and monstrous, and they were hairy. They had teeth, and they were always malevolent. And to me, the depictions were just so unique and unique from the time, like something out of weird fiction. He reworked and reinvented the ghost story into a form that became somehow accepted by the literary establishment. And there were a couple ingredients that made that work for him. He had the atmosphere, which you were talking about. And the thing that was unique to James is he called it a nicely managed crescendo. So in a James story, you have like this atmosphere established and the characters in their ordinary life, and the ghostly and the supernatural just keeps getting more insistent and ramping up until this M.R. James crescendo is reached. So, "Oh Whistle" and "Come to You, My Lad" follows that format. It's about a skeptical professor who finds a strange whistle, mysterious inscriptions, and then strange things happen. What is it about that particular story that puts it on your list, Lee?
Well, it's about a professor who finds a whistle. Honestly, what it is, it's the crescendo you're talking about. The story sets up this amazing atmosphere throughout, while this guy is exploring the Templar ruins and then finding the whistle, spending time on the beach. There's all this atmosphere being built. And he starts hearing from other people that they have seen something. And They don't know what it is. But it all comes down to this final scene where he's in a bed and the other bed in the room with him is empty, or so he thinks. And suddenly it looks as if someone is rising from that bed, all wrapped in the bed sheets. And as that scene progresses, it's amazing. It's a wonderful scene. Sorry, spoilers, but it's great. It is just such a strong scene.
Spoiler warning, it's amazing. There's a whistle.
Right.
Yeah, no, that scene is I'm a newcomer to M.R. James in the last few years, and that's a hell of a scene right there. As we were getting started, we were talking about very different kind of ghost, a very different kind of ghost story. We were talking about Julia by Peter Straub. It was one of his earlier novels that made possibly his third novel, I think from around 75, and it came out before Ghost Story. And what's so interesting about Julia, I mean, one of the many things, is that it's a psychological story. I see it as a forerunner to the psychological stories that came after it that are even popular today.
Sure.
What do you?
Yeah, what's great about that, and I've noticed this, through Straub's career, is his work always sort of acts as a bridge between, what we used to have and what's about to hit us in the face when it comes to genre. I mean, Ghost Story is a perfect example of that, his novel Ghost Story. But so is Julia, because what he's done is he's taken a very Gothic approach to the telling of the ghost story. But he's tweaking some of the tropes of it. And he's adding, and I don't know if this was intentional or not. I've not chatted with him about it. But I mean, there's this amazing metaphor that sort of carries out through the book about trying to escape abuse, and it's got this ambiguity to it that's initially, it's established right off the bat because our main character is coming out of a short-term commitment. So there's already a question as to her reliability, as to what she's seeing and how she's interpreting information. That's already built in when you start. And so as things get weirder and more upsetting, you're involved in it, but you're still not quite sure, is this something that's really happening to her, or is she processing incidents in the real world in this other way? By the end of it, you've got a full-on horrific kind of ghost story thing happening. I won't give away the ending or anything. But that's what he's doing near the end of that is much more like what we're seeing these days when it comes to a ghost story. So it's this nice bridge from the Gothic to what is very much contemporary modern ghost stories.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's just amazing what I mean. Straub is a masterful writer, and Julia is a mastery of a work. Yeah, it's just amazing how there's so many different things going on. You mentioned on the one hand, there's just that surface level. It's just interesting because of the ambiguity and just the tension going on. But whether it's real or not, it's an engrossing and it's an important book because it is a delivery system for the story about trauma and abuse as well. Why do you think ghost stories just lend themselves so well to why do the supernatural and psychological just seem to go so well hand in hand?
I'm not really a psychologist, but I mean, we all have been in situations where we've seen something out of the corner of our eye, or we've seen something in a distant window. We've seen something, and we're creatures of imagination. So, it's very natural for us to want to figure out what that is beyond just a trick of light or this, that, and the other. And then there's the emotional component. When you're dealing with grief, sometimes you want to believe that whoever it is that you've lost is, down at the end of that hall. Even if you can barely make them out, your brain's going to fill in the pieces and think, oh yeah, that's them. And it makes sense to you. And it does. It can be comforting to a lot of people. Ghosts aren't always terrifying to people. Sometimes they're a point of comfort.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no psychologist either, but what you said just makes sense. Like, I mean, of all the psychology we can talk about, and it's that bit of human nature where you said two things there. Like, yeah, we're creatures of imagination, and then you said sometimes we just want to believe it.
Sure.
Before we go into you're going to read some M.R. James for us. Do you have a local bookstore, Lee, that you want to mention?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to shout out to two of them. They
Great.
have very different functions here in town. Malvern Books is a great shop for indies. There's some self-publishing there, small press stuff, but almost all of it is indie focused, and they're really good. They're called Malvern Books, Malvern. The other is our big independent bookstore, which is Book People. And it's a wonderful store. I mean, I used to, before, we couldn't go out, I used to go there when I could, just to get some coffee, check out the mystery and horror sections. Great place, really good place.
Cool. Thanks so much for recommending those. And you're going to be reading from Lost Hearts by M.R. James. Why'd you pick this one for tonight?
Well, besides being just like this really great story, there's sort of I don't know how to explain it. And honestly, it would be a spoiler if I tried. So I won't say anything about it until the end.
Okay,
But,
very cool.
I like the story. It's very tight, very direct, and maybe a little bloodier than his usual stuff, or not necessarily bloody, but more graphic. Let's call it
All
that.
right. I don't think we're going to get many complaints. Here's Lee Thomas reading Lost Hearts by M.R. James. Thanks, Lee. Take it away.
This was first published in 1904, and it was featured in M.R. James's Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. Lost Hearts. It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of the year 1811 that a post-chaise drew up before the door of Aswarby Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy, who was the only passenger in the chaise and who jumped out as soon as it had stopped, looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the door. He saw a tall, square, red brick house built in the reign of Anne. A stone-pillared porch had been added in the pure classical style of 1790. The windows of the house were many, tall and narrow, with small panes and thick white woodwork. A pediment, pierced with a round window, crowned the front. There were wings to the right and left, connected by curious glazed galleries, supported by colonnades, with the central block. These wings plainly contained the stables and offices of the house. Each was surmounted by an ornamental cupola with a gilded vane. An evening light shone on the building, making the window panes glow like so many fires. Away from the hall, in front, stretched a flat park studded with oaks and fringed with firs, which stood out against the sky. The clock in the church tower, buried in trees on the edge of the park, only its golden weathercock catching the light, was striking 6, and the sound came gently beating down the wind. It was altogether a pleasant impression, though tinged with the sort of melancholy appropriate to an evening in early autumn, that was conveyed to the mind of the boy who was standing in the porch waiting for the door to open to him. The post-chaise had brought him from Warwickshire, where, some 6 months before, he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aswarby. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as a somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new, and it seemed, incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the later pagans than did the owner of Aswarby. Certainly, his library contained all the then available books bearing on the mysteries, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neoplatonists. In the marble-paved hall stood a fine group of Mithras slaying a bull, which had been imported from the Levant at great expense by the owner. He had contributed a description of it to the Gentleman's Magazine, and he had written a remarkable series of articles in the Critical Museum on the superstitions of the Romans of the Lower Empire. He was looked upon, in fine, as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbors that he should even have heard of his orphan cousin, Stephen Elliott, much more that he should have volunteered to make him an inmate of Aswarby Hall. Whatever may have been expected by his neighbors, it is certain that Mr. Abney, The tall, the thin, the austere seemed inclined to give his young cousin a kindly reception. The moment the front door was opened, he darted out of his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" said he. "That is, you are not too much tired, I hope, by your journey to eat your supper?" "No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliot. "I am pretty well." "That's a good lad," said Mr. Abney. "And how old are you?" "My boy?" Seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. "I'm 12 years old next birthday, sir," said Stephen. "And when is your birthday, my dear boy? 11th of September, eh? That's very well. Nearly a year hence, isn't it? I like to get these things down in my book. Sure it's 12, certain?" "Yes, quite sure, sir." "Well, well, take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and let him have his tea, supper, whatever it is." "Yes, sir," answered the staid Mr. Parks, and conducted Stephen to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had as yet met at Aswarby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been born in the neighborhood some 55 years before the date of Stephen's arrival, and her residence at the Hall was of 20 years' standing. Consequently, if anyone knew the ins and outs of the house and the district, Mrs. Bunch knew them, and she was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. Certainly, there were plenty of things about the Hall and the Hall gardens which Stephen, who was of an adventurous and inquiring turn, was anxious to have explained to him. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who is the old man whose picture hung on the staircase, sitting at a table with a skull under his hand? These and many similar points were cleared up by the resources of Mrs. Bunch's powerful intellect. There were others, however, of which the explanations furnished were less satisfactory. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room, reflecting on his surroundings. "Is Mr. Abney a good man, and will he go to heaven?" he suddenly asked, with the peculiar confidence which children possess in the ability of their elders to settle these questions, the decision of which is believed to be reserved for other tribunals. "Good? Bless the child," said Mrs. Bunch. "Master's as kind a soul as I ever see. Didn't I ever tell you of the little boy as he took in out of the street, as you may say, this 7 years back? And the little girl 2 years after I first come here? No, do tell me about them, Mrs. Bunch." "Well," said Mrs. Bunch, "the little girl I don't seem to recollect so much about. I know master brought her back with him from his walk one day, and give orders to Mrs. Ellis, as was housekeeper then, as she should be took every care with. And the poor child hadn't no one belonging to her, she told me so herself, and here she lived with us a matter of 3 weeks, it might be. And then, whether she were something of a gypsy in her blood or what not, but one morning she out of her bed afore any of us had opened an eye, and neither track nor yet trace of her have I set eyes on since. Master was wonderful, put about, and had all the ponds dragged, but it's my belief she was had away by them gypsies, for there was singing around the house for as much as an hour the night she went, and Parks, he declares he heard them a-calling in the woods all that afternoon. Dear, dear, an odd child she was, so silent in her ways and all, but I was wonderful taken up with her, so domesticated she was. Surprising." "And what about the little boy?" said Stephen. "Ah, that poor boy," sighed Mrs. Bunch. "He were a foreigner, Giovanni he called himself, and he come a-tweaking his hurdy-gurdy round and about the drive one winter day, and master had him in that minute, and asked all about where he came from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, and where was his relatives, and all as kind as heart could wish. But it went the same way with him. They're an unruly lot, them foreign nations, I do suppose, and he was off one fine morning just the same as the girl. Why he went and what he done was our question was for as much as a year after, for he never took his hurdy-gurdy, and there it lays on the shelf." The remainder of the evening was spent by Stephen in miscellaneous cross-examinations of Mrs. Bunch, and in efforts to extract a tune from the hurdy-gurdy. That night he had a curious dream. At the end of the passage, at the top of the house in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old disused bathroom. It was kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and since the muslin curtains which used to hang there had long been gone, you could look in and see the lead-lined bath affixed to the wall on the right hand, with its head towards the window. On the night of which I am speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he saw reminds me of what I once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Michan's Church in Dublin, which possessed the horrid property of preserving corpses from decay for centuries. A figure, inexpressibly thin and pathetic, of a dusty leaden color, enveloped in a shroud-like garment, the thin lips crooked into a faint and dreadful smile, the hands pressed tightly over the region of the heart. As he looked upon it, a distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor of the passage in the full light of the moon. With a courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure of his dream were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much impressed next morning by his story, and went so far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney, moreover, to whom he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested, and made notes of the matter in what he called his book. The spring equinox was approaching, as Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had been always considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself and to shut his bedroom window at night, and that Censorinus had some valuable remarks on the subject. Two incidents that occurred about this time made an impression upon Stephen's mind. The first was after an unusually uneasy and oppressed night that he had passed, though he could not recall any particular dream that he had had. The following evening, Mrs. Bunch was occupying herself in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably, "how do you manage to tear your nightdress all to flinders this way? Look here, sir, what trouble you do give poor servants that have to darn and mend after you." There was indeed a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits or scorings in the garment, which would undoubtedly require a skillful needle to make good. They were confined to the left side of the chest, long parallel slits about 6 inches in length, some of them not quite piercing the texture of the linen. Stephen could only express his entire ignorance of their origin. He was sure they were not there the night before. "But," he said, "Mrs. Bunch, they are just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door, and I'm sure I never had anything to do with making them." Mrs. Bunch gazed at him, open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room, and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes, she came down. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how them marks and scratches can have come there, too high up for any cat or dog to have made 'em, much less a rat. For all the world like a Chinaman's fingernails, as my uncle in the tea trade used to tell us of when we was girls together. I wouldn't say nothing to master, not if I was you, Master Stephen, my dear, and just turn the key of the door when you go to your bed. I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I've said my prayers. Ah, there's a good child. Always say your prayers, and then no one can't hurt you." Herewith, Mrs. Bunch addressed herself to mending the injured nightgown, with intervals of meditation, until bedtime. This was on a Friday night in March, 1812. On the following evening, the usual duet of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch was augmented by the sudden arrival of Mr. Parks, the butler, who, as a rule, kept himself, rather to himself, in his own pantry. He did not see that Stephen was there. He was, moreover, flustered, and less slow of speech than was his wont. "Master may get up his own wine if he likes of an evening," was his first remark. "Either I do it in the daytime or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what it may be. Very likely it's the rats or the wind got into the cellars, but I'm not so young as I was, and I can't go through with it as I have done." Well, Mr. Parks, you know it's a surprising place for the rats, is the hall. I'm not denying that, Mrs. Bunch. And to be sure, many a time I've heard the tale from the men in the shipyards about the rat that could speak. I never laid no confidence in that before, but tonight, if I'd demean myself to lay my ear to the door of the further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they was saying. Oh, there, Mr. Parks, I've no patience with your fancies. Rats talking in the wine cellar, indeed. Well, Mrs. Bunch, I've no wish to argue with you. All I say is, if you choose to go to the far bin and lay your ear to the door, you may prove my words this minute. What nonsense you do talk, Mr. Parks. Not fit for children to listen to. Why, you'll be frightening Master Stephen there out of his wits. What, Master Stephen? Said Parks, awaking to the consciousness of the boy's presence. Master Stephen knows well enough when I'm a-playing a joke with you, Mrs. Bunch. In fact, Master Stephen knew much too well to suppose that Mr. Parks had, in the first instance, intended a joke. He was interested, not altogether pleasantly, in the situation, but all his questions were unsuccessful in inducing the butler to give any more detailed account of his experiences in the wine cellar. We have now arrived at March 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experiences for Stephen, a windy, noisy day which filled the house and the gardens with a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds and looked out into the park, he felt as if an endless procession of unseen people were sweeping past him on the wind, borne on resistlessly and aimlessly, vainly striving to stop themselves, to catch at something that might arrest their flight and bring them once again into contact with the living world of which they had formed a part. After luncheon that day, Mr. Abney said, Stephen, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight as late as 11 o'clock in my study? I shall be busy until that time, and I wish to show you something connected with your future life, which it is most important that you should know. You're not to mention this matter to Mrs. Bunch, nor to anyone else in the house, and you had better go to your room at the usual time. Here was a new excitement added to life. Stephen eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up till 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door on his way upstairs that evening and saw a brazier, which he had often noticed in the corner of the room, moved out before the fire. An old silver gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine, and some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mr. Abney was sprinkling some incense on the brazier from a round silver box as Stephen passed, but did not seem to notice his step. The wind had fallen, and there was a still night and a full moon. At about 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the country. Still as the night was, the mysterious population of the distant moonlit woods was not yet lulled to rest. From time to time, strange cries as of lost and despairing wanderers sounded from across the mere. They might be the notes of owls or water birds, yet they did not quite resemble either sound. Were not they coming nearer? Now they sounded from the nearer side of the water, and in a few moments they seemed to be floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased. But just as Stephen was thinking of shutting the window and resuming his reading of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing on the graveled terrace that ran along the garden side of the hall. The figures of a boy and girl, as it seemed. They stood side by side, looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. The boy inspired him with more acute fear. Whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy, a thin shape with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air with an appearance of menace and of unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long, and that the light shone through them. As he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest, there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aswarby all that evening. In another moment, this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he saw them no more. Inexpressibly frightened as he was, he determined to take his candle and go down to Mr. Abney's study, for the hour appointed for their meeting was near at hand. The study or library opened out of the front hall on one side, and Stephen, urged on by his terrors, did not take long in getting there. To effect an entrance was not so easy. The door was not locked, he felt sure, for the key was on the outside of it, as usual. His repeated knocks produced no answer. Mr. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. What? Why did he try to cry out, and why was the cry choked in his throat? Had he too seen the mysterious children? But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded to Stephen's terrified and frantic pushing. On the table in Mr. Abney's study, certain papers were found which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott when he was of an age to understand them. The most important sentences were as follows. It was a belief very strongly and generally held by the ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have had such experiences as induces me to place confidence in their assertions, that by enacting certain processes, which to us moderns have something of a barbaric complexion, a very remarkable enlightenment of the spiritual faculties in man may be obtained. That, for example, by absorbing the personalities of a certain number of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain a complete ascendancy over those orders of spiritual beings which control the elemental forces of our universe. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, to become invisible, or to assume any form he pleased by the agency of the soul of a boy whom, to use the libelous phrase employed by the author of the Clementine Recognitions, he had murdered. I find it set down, moreover, with considerable detail in the writings of Hermes, that similar happy results may be produced by the absorption of the hearts of not less than 3 human beings below the age of 21 years. To the testing of the truth of this receipt, I have devoted the greater part of the last 20 years, selecting as the corpora vilia of my experiment such persons as could conveniently be removed without occasioning a sensible gap in society. The first step I effected by the removal of one Phoebe Stanley, a girl of gypsy extraction, on March 24th, 1792. The second, by the removal of a wandering Italian lad named Giovanni Paoli on the night of March 23rd, 1805. The final victim, to employ a word repugnant in the highest degree to my feelings, must be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. His day must be this March, 1812. The best means of effecting the required absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes, and to mingle them with about a pint of some red wine, preferably port. The remains of the first 2 subjects, at least, it will be well to conceal. A disused bathroom or a wine cellar will be found convenient for such a purpose. Some annoyance may be experienced from the psychic portion of the subjects, which popular language dignifies with the name of ghosts. But the man of philosophic temperament, to whom alone the experiment is appropriate, will be little prone to attach importance to the feeble efforts of these beings to wreak their vengeance on him. I contemplate with the liveliest satisfaction the enlarged and emancipated existence which the experiment, if successful, will confer on me, not only placing me beyond the reach of human justice, so called, but eliminating to a great extent the prospect of death itself. Mr. Abney was found in his chair, his head thrown back, his face stamped with an expression of rage, fright, and mortal pain. In his left side was a terrible lacerated wound exposing the heart. There was no blood on his hands, and a long knife that lay on the table was perfectly clean. A savage wildcat might have inflicted the injuries. The window of the study was open, and it was the opinion of the coroner that Mr. Abney had met his death by the agency of some wild creature. But Stephen Elliott's study of the papers, I've quoted here, led him to a very different conclusion. Thank you.
Well done, Lee. Well done, Lee. Such a hearing some echo. Sorry about that echo, but what a great reading. Lost Hearts, indeed. I could see the appeal of that
Yeah,
one.
I think it's a great one.
And and some holiday recipes in there as well. Holiday recipes and how to fly. So thanks so much, Lee. Stick around for um, Douglas's reading.
Absolutely.
Next up is Douglas Wynne. Douglas Wynne is the author of 9 horror and dark fantasy books, including Red Equinox, The Devil of Echo Lake, and The Wind in My Heart. His short fiction has appeared in numerous anthologies, and his writing workshops have been featured at genre conventions and schools throughout New England. His first novel, The Devil of Echo Lake, is part ghost story. He's written a few short stories featuring ghosts that haven't been published yet, and his forthcoming novel, His Own Devices, has a ghost story element. He lives in Massachusetts with his wife and son and a house full of animals. You can find him on the web at www.douglaswynne.com. How are you, Doug?
Well,
Thanks for
Dan.
being
Thanks
here.
for
Yeah,
having me.
it's real fun. I'm just enjoying all the ghost stories and talking to everybody. One of the ghost stories that we were talking about was another classic one, another old one. It was called The Upper Berth by F. Marion Crawford. And when I was checking that one out,
Right.
had a great name of where it first appeared. It first was published in a periodical called The Broken Shaft, Tales in Mid-Ocean, which was the 1886 issue of Unwin's Christmas Annual. So it was another old story, another classic story, haunted ocean liner, strange happenings going on, and the ghost was like an M.R. James ghost. It was something equally weird. So my first ghost story question for you is, why do ghost stories seem to lend themselves and work so well with weird fiction?
What Lee was saying got me thinking more about that, and I think for me, I hadn't really realized this before about myself, but my own attraction, I think, to ghost stories um, is I think they're an example. You guys talked a bit about ambiguity in the ghost story, and you see that these days in the novels of Paul Tremblay. But there's a long tradition of that. You see it, like you guys mentioned, in some Peter Straub work as well. And I think ghosts give us an opportunity to question the nature of what's real. I think in a way they're similar to UFO phenomena, right? The mistake I've always perceived there is people will latch onto a belief that they've figured it out, and it's this one thing. This is what explains that phenomena, whether it's ghosts or UFOs or whatever weird thing you've got. The mistake there is obviously that our perceptions are such a fluid thing, and as you said, we're creatures of imagination, as Lee said. um and so the explanations are probably very varied. There's all kinds of things that could explain people's experiences of a weird sort. So in the ghost story and in maybe the UFO tale, I also find these opportunities to question everything that we think we understand, all the things that we think we believe about reality, about each other, about our daily experiences. They're not as solid as we typically believe. We get into these ingrained patterns of thinking we understand the shapes of things and the causes of things. But it's when we read stories that take place in those liminal areas that we get to explore how people process what they don't yet understand, and that's what fascinates me about them anyway.
Oh, that's a great answer. It's a great way of looking at the ghost story, a great way of looking at weird fiction. I mean, before I started thinking about it, I mean, just one of the things I know I liked about stories in general. Was I like those ambiguous stories where they were sort of a blot where someone could look at it and be like, "Oh, did you see that?" Or, "Oh, it was all in her head or all in his head." And yeah, it's just great that when fiction and weird fiction and ghost stories can give you the opportunity to just be that vehicle to question things. Um, especially in today's times. There's so much there's so much to question, and the nature of reality, the nature of technology is just speeding forward. Your forthcoming novel, His Own Devices, and a prequel novella, they explore the intersection of technology and the supernatural without spoiling too much. Um, can you talk a bit about this relationship of technology and the supernatural in general and in your work?
Yeah, sure. That's a topic that I seem to keep getting drawn back to, but more overtly in these new pieces that are coming out. Here's the marketing part of the program. Today I released a novella on my website, douglaswynne.com. I think dougwynne.com will also get you there. I think I've got my bases covered. That's a free download for subscribers to my mailing list, and this sets up the novel His Own Devices, which will be out in March. And in His Own Devices, we have the story of a boy who becomes involved with a psychotic YouTube celebrity in the gaming community, who is himself being manipulated by a conspiracy that is not entirely clear, but there are powers that are using him because he's an influencer. And they're messing with his mind. He's a vulnerable target for this kind of mind programming, and making him question the nature of reality, making him question whether or not he's living in a simulation, whether or not helping his young fans to level up rather than grow up might be a noble cause. So I was interested, with a young kid myself. He's 13 now, but at the time that I started conceiving this book and writing it, I had I think the typical concerns of a modern parent about what's going to come out of all of this screen time that they very quickly adapt to at a young age these days. Who are they encountering there, and how do I monitor that, and just the use itself, will that have an effect on a developing brain? These are the kind of things you end up talking about with a pediatrician these days. So I realize that there's a rich vein of fear to be mined there for many of us. And that got me thinking more and more about the role of technology in horror fiction, and the intersection of technology and the supernatural, which you mentioned. There's an academic like college textbook called the Palgrave Handbook to Horror Literature. The last edition of that, there's an essay called Monstrous Machines and Devilish Devices that goes into this in some detail. It's worth looking up. It's by Gwyneth Peedy. And she talks a bit about how new technology is inherently uncanny because science, like the supernatural, makes us question the limits of the natural world. And some of the examples she brings up are how people responded to the invention of the telegraph. Suddenly, if you could communicate with someone across the Atlantic in a matter of minutes, surely next you'd be talking to the dead. And I think we still have this apprehension about technology. We're simultaneously attracted to it and afraid of it. It represents these faceless forces in our life, and these little miracles of communication at a distance, like we're doing here tonight, of action at a distance. So like the Arthur Clarke quote, any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. That to me is a very interesting area to explore in fiction. So there are supernatural elements in these two, in the novella, Random Access. It's hinted at. In His Own Devices, it's a bit more overt. Technology as a vehicle for contact with the weird and the unknown. And that's why I picked the Richard Matheson story that I want to read for you tonight. Long Distance Call, which is I think with Lee we started back in the 1800s. Now we're moving up to the 1950s with Matheson, who wrote a lot of stuff for the Twilight Zone. A lot of his stories were adapted in that era, so it's I think a classic Matheson tale.
Oh well, hey, I'm looking forward to reading your new stuff. I haven't had a chance to read those yet, but you do such a great job with technology and the supernatural, even in little bits and pieces of your it comes into play in your Spectra files. Just so many interesting little weird little devices that or not so little devices that do intersect with the other side or the other or the weird. And you hit on my next question. I was just going to ask why you picked this particular one by Matheson. How does technology come into play in the story you're about to read for us, Doug?
So I think for any younger viewers, we probably have to set up the story by explaining that telephones used to have wires. They used to plug into the wall.
What's
And
vital?
right. And so you'd have a local exchange and an operator that you maybe knew by name, and that would be the person, plugging wires in to a big, board of jacks, like in a recording studio, to connect calls and address any technical issues you had. If someone in your house picked up a telephone, that would be the same line, and so someone could listen in on your call. So there's an infirm elderly woman in the story, the main character, who experiences some weirdness with her telephone on a stormy night that continues to plague her for a few days. So very old school tech ghost story. From
You mean these phones are used to, people use them to talk to each
To
other?
talk.
How,
Imagine
how
that.
inventive! How inventive! Before you read from your story, is there a local bookstore that you want to let people know about? You did mention some really interesting books having to do with technology and the supernatural. Any places readers might go hunt for them?
Well, for people in New England, in my neck of the woods, my two favorite local independent bookstores are Jabberwocky in Newburyport, where I live, and in Exeter, New Hampshire, is Water Street Books. Both of these stores have hosted my reading events and have really good genre fiction sections. Water Street in Exeter has typically some signed Joe Hill stuff. If I think anybody who lives near it knows that, yeah, it's local to him. But for New York, I grew up on Long Island and haven't lived in New York in many years. I think most of the bookstores I used to frequent in the city are maybe not even there anymore. There was the Magical Child occult bookstore, which I know is closed. I used to also go to, for books related to the supernatural, East West Books. I'm not sure if that's still there either.
I'm not
Might
sure.
be.
Amazing that you mentioned the Magical Child. That's quite a bookstore. Quite a bookstore.
But when I visited you, we went to the Strand, which was a real treat for me. I had not been there before, so
Yeah,
that's my new favorite New York bookstore.
a very New York bookstore. Okay, so here, everyone, is Douglas Wynne reading "Long Distance Call" by Richard Matheson. Take it away, Doug.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to just say at the outset, I feel a little weird about it, but to fit our time constraints here, I have slightly abridged this Matheson story. I wanted to deliver it as a complete. The ending is important, so I I am not qualified to edit Richard Matheson, but it was a very educational experience to try to figure out each piece and what role it plays and how essential and why. I recommend doing that sometime. Check out the original when you have time. So this will be the kind of the Reader's Digest version of this. Long distance call. Just before the telephone rang, storm winds toppled the tree outside her window and jolted Miss Keene from dreaming sleep. She flung herself up with a gasp, her frail hands crumpling twists of sheet in either palm. Beneath her fleshless chest, the heart jerked taut. The sluggish blood spurred. She sat in rigid muteness, her eyes staring at the night. In another second, the telephone rang. Who on earth? The question shaped unwittingly in her brain. Her thin hand faltered in the darkness, the fingers searching a moment, and then Miss Elvakeen drew the cool receiver to her ear. Hello, she said. Outside, a cannon of thunder shook the night, twitching Miss Keene's crippled legs. I've missed the voice, she thought. The thunder has blotted out the voice. Hello, she said again. There was no sound. Miss Keene waited in expectant lethargy. Then she repeated, hello, in a cracking voice. Outside, the thunder crashed again. Still, no voice spoke. Not even the sound of a phone being disconnected met her ears. Her wavering hand reached out and thumped down the receiver with an angry motion. Inconsideration, she muttered, thudding back on her pillow. Already her infirm back ached from the effort of sitting. She forced out a weary breath. Now she'd have to suffer through the whole tormenting process of going to sleep again, the composing of jaded muscles, the ignoring of abrasive pain in her legs, the endless frustrating struggle to turn off the faucet dripping in her brain and keep unwanted thoughts from dripping. Oh well, it had to be done. Nurse Phillips insisted on proper rest. Elva Keene breathed slowly and deeply, drew the covers to her chin, and labored hopefully for sleep. In vain. There hadn't even been the sound of a receiver replaced in its cradle. Miss Keene didn't understand that. Why would anyone call her exchange and then listen silently while she said hello over and over again? Had it actually been anyone calling? What she should have done was to speak out forcefully about the inconsideration of a prankish call to a crippled maiden lady in the middle of a stormy night. Then, if there had been someone listening, whoever it was would have been properly chastened by her angry words, and, well, of course. She said it aloud in the darkness, punctuating the sentence with a cluck of somewhat relieved disgust. Of course. The telephone was out of order. Someone had tried to contact her, perhaps Nurse Phillips, to see if she was all right, but the other end of the line had broken down in some way. Well, of course that was the case. Miss Keene nodded once and closed her eyes gently. Now to sleep, she thought. Far away beyond the country, the storm cleared its murky throat. I hope no one is worrying, Elva Keene thought. That would be too bad. She was thinking that when the telephone rang again. There, she thought, they are trying to reach me again. She reached out hurriedly in the darkness, fumbled until she felt the receiver, then pulled it to her ear. Hello, said Miss Keene. Silence. Hello, she said tentatively, not yet certain that she was wasting breath. There was no reply. She waited a moment, then spoke a third time, a little impatiently now, loudly, her shrill voice ringing in the dark bedroom. Hello! Nothing. Miss Keene had the sudden urge to fling the receiver away. She forced down that curious instinct. No, she must wait. Wait and listen to hear if anyone hung up the phone on the other end of the line. So she waited. There was no sound from the telephone. Not a click, not a buzz, not a sound of someone putting down a receiver. Hello, she said suddenly, then pushed away the receiver. She missed the target. The receiver dropped and thumped once on the rug. Miss Keene nervously clicked on the lamp, wincing as the leprous bulb light filled her eyes. Quickly, she lay on her side and tried to reach the silent, voiceless telephone. But she couldn't stretch far enough, and crippled legs prevented her from rising. Her throat tightened. My God, must she leave it there all night, silent and mystifying? Remembering then, she reached out abruptly and pressed the cradle arm. On the floor, the receiver clicked, then began to buzz normally. Elva Keene swallowed and drew in a shaking breath as she slumped back on her pillow. Early the next morning, after Nurse Phillips had taken away the breakfast dishes, Elva Keene called the telephone company. This is Miss Elva, she told the operator. Oh, yes, Miss Elva, said the operator, a Miss Finch. Can I help you? Last night my telephone rang twice, said Elva Keene, but when I answered it, no one spoke, and I didn't hear my receiver drop. I didn't even hear a dial tone, just silence. Well, I'll tell you, Miss Elva, said the cheery voice of Miss Finch. That storm last night just about ruined half our service. We're being flooded with calls about knocked down lines and bad connections. I'd say you're pretty lucky your phone is working at all. Then you think it was probably a bad connection, prompted Miss Keene, caused by the storm? Oh, yes, Miss Elva, that's all. Do you think it will happen again? Oh, it may, said Miss Finch. It may. I really couldn't tell you, Miss Elva. But if it does happen again, you just call me, and then I'll have one of our men check on it. All right, said Miss Elva. Thank you, dear. She lay on her pillows all morning in a relaxed torpor. It gives one a satisfied feeling, she thought, to solve a mystery, slight as it is. It had been a terrible storm that caused the bad connection. Nurse Phillips left the house at 8, leaving on the bedside table as usual an apple, a cookie, a glass of water, and the bottle of pills. She puffed up the pillows behind Miss Keene's fragile back, moved the radio and telephone a little closer to the bed, looked around complacently, then turned for the door, saying, I'll see you tomorrow. It was 15 minutes later when the telephone rang. Keene picked up the receiver quickly. She didn't bother saying hello this time. She just listened. At first it was the same, an absolute silence. She listened a moment more, impatiently. Then, on the verge of replacing the receiver, she heard the sound. Her cheek twitched. She jerked the telephone back to her ear. "Hello?" she asked tensely. A murmuring, a dull humming, a rustling sound. What was it? Miss Keene shut her eyes tightly, listening hard, but she couldn't identify the sound. It was too soft, too undefined. It deviated from a sort of whining vibration to an escape of air to a bubbling sibilance. It must be the sound of the connection, she thought. It must be the telephone itself making the noise. Perhaps a wire blowing in the wind somewhere. Perhaps. She stopped thinking then. She stopped breathing. The sound had ceased. Once more, silence rang in her ears. She could feel the heartbeats stumbling in her chest again, the walls of her throat closing in. Oh, this is ridiculous, she told herself. I've already been through this. It was the storm, the storm. She lay back on her pillows, the receiver pressed to her ear, nervous breaths faltering from her nostrils. She could feel unreasoning dread rise like a tide within her, despite all attempts at sane deduction. Her mind kept slipping off the glassy perch of reason. She kept falling deeper and deeper. Now she shuddered violently as the sounds began again. They couldn't possibly be human sounds, she knew, and yet there was something about them, some inflection, some almost identifiable arrangement of... Her lips shook and a whine began to hover in her throat. But she couldn't put down the telephone. She simply couldn't. The sounds held her hypnotized. Whether they were the rise and fall of the wind or the muttering of faulty mechanisms, she didn't know, but they would not let her go. "Hello," she murmured shakily. The sounds rose in volume. They rattled and shook in her brain. "Hello," answered a voice on the telephone. Then Miss Keene fainted dead away. "Are you certain it was someone saying hello?" Miss Finch asked Miss Elva over the telephone. "It might have been the connection, you know." "I tell you, it was a man," a shaking Elva Keene cried. "It was the same man who kept listening to me say hello over and over again without answering me back. The same one who made terrible noises over the telephone." Miss Finch cleared her throat politely. "Well, I'll have a man check your line, Miss Elva, as soon as he can. Of course, the men are very busy now with all the repairs on storm wreckage, but as soon as it's possible." After she'd hung up, Miss Keene lay against the pillows tensely. Miss Finch didn't believe her story. That was apparent. Miss Finch thought she was a nervous old woman falling prey to imagination. Well, Miss Finch would find out differently. "I'll just keep calling her until she does," she said irritably to Nurse Phillips just before afternoon nap. "You just do that," said Nurse Phillips. "Now take your pill and lie down." Miss Keene lay in grumpy silence, her vein-rutted hands knotted at her sides. It was after 2, and the house was silent in the October afternoon. It makes me angry, thought Elva Keene, that no one will take this seriously. Well, her thin lips pressed together. The next time the telephone rings, I'll make sure that Nurse Phillips listens until she does hear something. Exactly then, the phone rang. Miss Keene felt a cold tremor lace down her body. Even in the daylight with sunbeams speckling her flowered coverlet, the strident ringing frightened her. She dug porcelain teeth into her lower lip to steady it. Shall I answer it? The question came, and then, before she could even think to answer, her hand picked up the receiver. A deep, ragged breath. She drew the phone to her ear. She said, "Hello?" The voice answered back. "Hello," hollow and inanimate. "Who is this?" Miss Keene asked, trying to keep her throat clear. "Hello." "Who's calling, please?" "Hello." "Is anyone there?" "Hello." "Please." Miss Keene jammed down the receiver and lay on her bed, trembling violently, unable to catch her breath. What is it? Begged her mind. What in God's name is it? "Margaret," she cried. "Margaret." In the front room, she heard Nurse Phillips grunt abruptly and then start coughing. "Margaret, please." "What is it?" grumbled the nurse. "Does your stomach ache?" Miss Keene's throat drew in tautly as she swallowed. "He just called again," she whispered. "Who?" "That man." "What man?" "The one who keeps calling," Miss Keene said. "He keeps saying hello over and over again. That's all he says. Hello, hello." "Now stop this," Nurse Phillips scolded stolidly. "Lie back and..." "I don't want to lie back," she said frenziedly. "I want to know who this terrible person is who keeps frightening me." "Now, don't work yourself into a state," warned Nurse Phillips. "You know how upset your stomach gets." Miss Keene began to sob bitterly. I'm afraid of him." Why does he keep calling me? She shut her tear-bright eyes and forced her lips into a twitching line. In her mind, the man's subdued and listless voice kept echoing over and over, the inflection never altering, the question never deferring to her replies, just repeating itself endlessly in doleful apathy. Hello, hello, making her shudder to the heart. Look, Nurse Phillips spoke. She opened her eyes and saw the blurred image of the nurse putting the receiver down on the table. There, Nurse Phillips said. Nobody can call you now. You leave it that way. If you need anything, all you have to do is dial. Now, isn't that all right? Isn't it? Miss Keene looked bleakly at her nurse. Then, after a moment, she nodded once, grudgingly. She lay in the dark bedroom, the sound of the dial tone humming in her ear, keeping her awake. Miss Keene felt around the bed until she found her jacket. She draped it over the receiver, swathing its black smoothness in woolly turns. Then she sank back again, stern-breathed and taut. I will sleep, she demanded. I will sleep. She heard it still. Her body grew rigid, and abruptly she unfolded the receiver from its thick wrappings and slammed it down angrily on the cradle. Silence filled the room with a delicious peace. Miss Keene fell back on the pillow with a feeble groan. Now to sleep, she thought. The telephone rang. Surrounding her in a cloud of ear-lancing vibration, she reached out to put the receiver on the table again, then jerked her hand back with a gasp, realizing she would hear the man's voice again. What I'll do, she planned, is take off the receiver very quickly and put it down, then push down on the arm and cut off the line. Yes, that's what I'll do. She tensed herself and spread her hand out cautiously until the ringing phone was under it. Then, breath held, she followed her plan, slashed off the ring, reached quickly for the cradle arm, and stopped, frozen, as the man's voice reached out through darkness to hers. Where are you? He asked. I want to talk to you. Claws of ice clamped down on Miss Keene's shuddering chest. A sound from Miss Keene's throat, thin and fluttering, and the man said, Where are you? I want to talk to you. No, no, sobbed Miss Keene. Where are you? I want... She pressed the cradle arm with taut white fingers. She held it down for 5 minutes before letting it go. You say you hang up on this man and he still calls? Miss Finch inquired. I've explained all that, Elva Keene burst out. I had to leave the receiver off the phone all night so he wouldn't call, and the buzzing kept me awake. I didn't get a wink of sleep. Now I want this line checked, do you hear me? I want you to stop this terrible thing. Her eyes were like hard, dark beads. The phone almost slipped from her palsied fingers. All right, Miss Elva, said the operator. I'll send a man out today. Thank you, dear. Thank you, Miss Keene said. Will you call me when... Her voice stopped abruptly by a clicking sound started on the telephone. The line is busy, she announced. The clicking stopped, and she went on. To repeat, will you let me know when you find out who this terrible person is? Surely, Miss Elva, surely. And I'll have a man check your telephone this afternoon. You're at 127 Mill Lane, aren't you? That's right, dear. You will see to it, won't you? I promise faithfully, Miss Elva. First thing today. Thank you, dear, Miss Keene said, drawing in a relieved breath. But when 2 o'clock came, and then 3 o'clock, and still no repairman at her house, Miss Keene began worrying again. What's the matter with that girl? She said pettishly. She promised me faithfully that a man would come this afternoon. He'll be here, Nurse Phillips said. Be patient. 4 o'clock arrived, and no man. What had begun to loosen was tightening again, increasing minute by minute, until 5 o'clock when the telephone rang. Her hand spurted out rigidly from the flaring sleeve of her bed jacket and clamped down like a claw on the receiver. If the man speaks, raced her mind, if he speaks, I'll scream until my heart stops. She pulled the receiver to her ear. Hello? Miss Elva, this is Miss Finch. Her eyes closed and breath fluttered through her lips. Yes, she said. About those calls you say you've been receiving? Yes. In her mind, Miss Finch's words cutting those calls you say you've been receiving. We sent a man out to trace them, continued Miss Finch. I have his report here. Miss Keene caught her breath. Yes? He couldn't find anything. He says he traced the difficulty to a fallen wire on the edge of town. Fallen wire? Yes, Miss Elva. Miss Finch did not sound happy. You're telling me I didn't hear anything? Miss Finch's voice was firm. There's no way anyone could have phoned you from that location, she said. I tell you, a man called me. Miss Finch was silent, and Miss Keene's fingers tightened convulsively on the receiver. There must be a phone there, she insisted. There must be some way a man was able to call me. Miss Elva, there's no one out there. Out where? Where? The operator said. Miss Elva, it's the cemetery. In the black silence of her bedroom, a crippled maiden lay waiting. Her nurse would not remain for the night. Her nurse had patted her and scolded her and ignored her. She was waiting for a telephone call. She could have disconnected the phone, but she had not the will. She lay there waiting, thinking of the silence, of ears that had not heard, seeking to hear again, of sounds bubbling and muttering, the first stumbling attempts at speech by one who had not spoken how long, of hello, hello, first greeting by one long silent, of where are you, of that which made her lie so rigidly, the clicking and the operator speaking her address, of the telephone ringing, a pause, ringing, the rustle of a nightgown in the dark. The ringing stopped, listening, and the telephone slipping from white fingers, the eyes staring, the thin heartbeats slowly pulsing. Outside, the cricket rattling night. Inside, the words still sounding in her brain, giving terrible meaning to the heavy, choking silence. Hello, Miss Elva. I'll be right over. Richard Matheson.
Fantastic. Great reading there, Doug.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, great delivery. It's just been a joy. It's been you three are such great people, such great talents, and it's just been a joy to hear this, and a great choice for the festival. I mean, it just shows another thing how technology can really date and place a story in a specific just point in the continuum there. I mean, I think that story is indicative of a certain kind of horror story, in addition to being the ghost story. So it's really cool to see that.
Yeah, it's got a template sort of vibe to it. When you read it all these years later, you kind of just feel all the echoes of it, right? All the influence that stories like that had.
Yeah, and I think it's important for stories that stories can do that for us and for different generations of readers. Who knows what the kids like? We'll have to try it out on the younger generations, but I sure enjoyed it. So I'm going to stick around. I'm going to make a couple of mentions here before we continue on with Sarah Langan. For those of you tuned in, this stream will remain here right at the link that you're following as an archive, as will all 6 of the festival date events. You could watch them here live, or you could come back to the channel at your leisure if you can't make any one of them, or if you want to check them out. You can hit subscribe if that's your thing. Just subscribe to this channel. Stay in touch. Also on the channel are other events, including coming up in 2021. All the Nighttime Logic events will be up there. Douglas Wynne, who you just heard, was a guest back in the good old days when we used to meet at bars, such as a now defunct Lovecraft bar. He was a Nighttime Logic guest. And we're really pleased that Sarah Langan is going to be coming back January 14th. We're going to talk about her latest novel, the forthcoming Good Neighbors. The full festival dates, the next one is December 14th, this Monday, and December 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. December 20th at 4 p.m. That's a Sunday afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to wrap it up on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve Ghost Stories on December 24th at 7 p.m. I do want to thank Lee, Douglas, and Sarah, as well as all 20 readers of the festival. If you want to support, you can donate via our Ko-fi account, which is kofi.com/nighttime logic. You can support me by checking out my latest book, Underworld Dreams. And next up, we're going to talk with and hear from Sarah Langan. Sarah Langan grew up on Long Island, like Doug and I, and has an MFA in creative writing as well as a master's in environmental health science toxicology. She now lives in Los Angeles with her husband, daughters, and a giant pushy rabbit. She's received 3 Bram Stoker Awards, and her work has often been included in best of the year lists and anthologies. She recently published You Have the Prettiest Mask in Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet from Small Beer Press and LitHub, and her next novel, Good Neighbors, is out from Simon & Schuster in February 2021. And please, please welcome Sarah Langan. How are you, Sarah? I'm turning your mic on right now.
Hi, I'm good. I'm good. Your readings were great, you guys. I loved hearing ghost stories. It's really fun. Thank you.
Yeah, what a great night of readings. And you are no stranger to the ghost story. Your Bram Stoker Award-winning novels, The Keeper and Audrey's Door, as well as your short stories, The Lost, won Bram Stoker Awards. The Lost, Sacred Cows, and Afterlife stories have been reprinted at Nightmare Magazine. Sarah, what's the appeal of the ghost story to you? First, as a writer, how does the ghost element bring across what you're after in a story?
I think it's, as a reader and a writer, ghost stories are actually scary. And I'm not typically scared by many things, but a ghost sort of represents not just the inevitability of death, but the possibility that there actually is something malignant that we humans have no control over. And that's kind of terrifying. And so anytime that's represented, you can't help but think it's real. Anytime you watch a ghost story or read a ghost story, an author is saying that not only are there things we have no control over, but those things know things about us, and those things are malignant. And I think every other kind of story, when it's grounded in any kind of realism or it's a thriller, you can logic your way out of it. But just like the inevitability of death, you cannot logic your way out of a ghost story. You're trapped in it. And I think that's super terrifying.
That's absolutely brilliant. And it's just such a cool lens to look at the other 2 stories. As you were saying that, I immediately thought of the unreliable narrator in the M.R. James story Lee was reading, right when it gets to the part where he's like, yeah, you can just cut up these hearts and make this drink, and yeah, you can fly, and you can fly, and like, yeah, that's terrifying, both on like, okay, it's like a proto serial killer story, but when you just really astutely got to the heart of things, where it's like the inevitability of death and the lack we humans have control over that and over life. It's such a fantastic way of looking at the ghost story. One of the ghost stories that you mentioned when we were preparing for this was The Shining, which has a lot of things going on in it. But in addition to being a ghost story, it's also a haunted house story. It's got a haunted hotel and the ghost of the hotel. How would you say King uses ghosts in The Shining, and what's the appeal of it for you?
I think that The Shining, is a couple of things going on. It's sort of the fear as a parent of fucking up your kid, and I think there's the main character's alcoholism was sort of just, I once interviewed the head of psychology at Winthrop Hospital because I was trying to get some background on something, and he said the dry drunk scene in the book The Shining was the most realistic and best dry drunk scene he'd ever read. And he explained what a dry drunk is to me, which is insane, which is just like a drunk who's sober can convince themselves they're drunk and act drunk, and their body can be affected. So in that way, I think The Shining is very much about the terror of Jack Torrance foisting upon his son Danny the same things that his monstrous father did to him, because throughout that book, he's just fighting with his dad. Every man in the book is his dad, and he hates his dad. And so what does he feel about his son? Because that's really interesting. So there's the supernatural. Is it really happening? Is it not happening? Is it just psychological aspect? And then there's the real, no, it's really happening. Like in the book, it's very clearly really happening, as opposed to the Kubrick version. And that ghost part, I think, is really terrifying too, because it's Danny making this happen, right? Danny has no control over his thoughts and winds the clock in that book. And when he winds the clock, he's really winding the Overlook Hotel. He's starting it. He's creating something. He's manifesting it. How much of that haunting is caused by Danny, and why? And who the hell is Tony? You know, is Tony his future self? You know, and just don't go into the other books that King wrote, but just in this book, it's totally unclear if Tony's his future self or Tony's another piece of shit demon. You know, it's really some good stuff going on. It doesn't feel inevitable, so I think that's why it's a great read, but it's not that scary, because it feels escapable. There's a logic way out.
It's absolutely amazing. Yeah, what a fantastic analysis of The Shining. It's just fantastic. Because I just love it so much, and yeah, you really hit on. It's a great example of, as you pointed out, how when the psychological and supernatural are standing side by side, and you can't really extract them. There's just that absolute realism and horror of how awful the relationship between Danny and his father. And then, like, as you mentioned, yes, Danny, and that is just fueling the supernatural elements of it. It's just, it's an absolutely brilliant psychological and supernatural story. Another one I wanted to ask you about was one we were talking about, and I want to make sure I have the name right. The Joyce Carol Oates story. Now, is the name of that story The Doll? Yeah, I think it's
The Doll. Like, I'll have to get back to you. Somebody on my Facebook feed found it.
I think she has a couple of stories. Like, there's it might be The Doll Master, but I'm not sure. Whatever the name of it, tell us a bit about your memory about that story, and how Joyce Carol Oates makes use of the ghosts.
I read it in my early 20s, but so, if you have read it and you're watching this, like, I'm probably not doing it any justice, but it's this woman who has this dream, or no, she's at a point in her life where she's made decisions that have made her alone, and she's approaching middle age. That's what I remember from the story. And she goes to this house, and inside the house is, God, I mean, this is what I remember, and I'm not sure it's completely right. Inside the house looks like the dollhouse she had as a child. And the dollhouse she had as a child was like this perfect house. And when she goes inside this house that she discovers that looks just like it, the dolls are people now, and they've all rotten. And they've, gone rotten because the dream has gone rotten. And I remember like urine. Like, I think the father has peed himself or something. And it's horrible. And she leaves. And it's so heartbreaking. It's this dream that she had, but it's a false dream, right? Every girl given a dollhouse with everything being perfect and this nuclear family, that's impossible. No girl is ever going to really have the way that they think it looks. And so, it works on two levels. It works on the level of regret and the dream that died. And it also works on the level of a dream that never existed, a lie that was told to her that she couldn't possibly have. So it's cool. And, it never says those things. It's just she goes to this house that looks like a dollhouse, and everyone inside it is decrepit.
Yeah, it just I like your answers are super astute, but I like that you just hit on it. It's just cool, you know. I mean, you know, as psychological as they are, we just these stories are just fun as well. Speaking of haunted houses, Audrey's Door, your award-winning novel, is in many ways a modern haunted house story that is very multi-layered and brings in psychological elements and a really unique haunted house. Can you tell us a bit about the haunted house that appears in your story and how it works with the psychological things that we find in Audrey's story?
Sure. First off, I just want to say, like, I should have read the fine print. I didn't realize everyone was reading amazing classic stories. And so I was like, Dan, I'll just read. I got something, I could read it. So I'm reading my own story, but it's not because I'm like that arrogant. Like, I really just did not know.
We love your work. I'm really, you've written so many ghost stories. I'm just really excited to hear from you. Which story did you land on? Are we reading from Audrey's story right?
Well, I was going to read Night Nurse, and then I was like, wait, that's not a ghost story. So I'm reading Audrey's Door.
All right. So, hey. It all lands. I mean, I got to tell you, I was excited. Like, I have, you know, I'm excited to hear from Night Nurse. I'm going to read it to myself. I'm equally, like, Audrey's Door is just such a great haunted house novel. It's such a great ghost story, and it's just one of my favorites. So I'm really excited that we landed on that and for the opportunity to talk to you about it. So yeah, you were talking about the haunted house and the psychological in Audrey's Door.
Oh, well, I came up with this. I on my honeymoon with my husband, we went to Barcelona and we saw the Gaudis, which are these crazy, beautiful buildings that aren't quite Euclidean. And they're beautiful and they follow the rules of nature. And I thought, well, what if there were these buildings that were the opposite, that despise nature, that were non-Euclidean, and somehow we're still standing, but everything about them made you uncomfortable, and sort of the very architecture manifested evil or malice. So that was my idea. And so the history of the breviary, which is the name of the building, is that it was founded by this madman who discovered this architecture called chaotic naturalism, and where buildings defy nature and nothing stands the way it should, and balls put in the center of a room will always roll into some strange place, and it's a religion at the same time. So that was the start of the haunted house idea. And then in this particular story, my main character is running from her life and has like a very abusive, difficult background, and sort of manages, the way we all do, to kind of just move ahead and go on and do the things we need to do to be grown-ups. And she's successful at that, but she's unsuccessful in maintaining a relationship with the man that she loves, which I think is a common and kind of tragic situation for people who can overcome so much until they get there. And so that's where she's at. She breaks up with him and she finds an apartment and she moves into it. And that's what I'm going to be reading from, is just the chapter where she moves in to this building where it seems the rent is too good to be true, and everyone there is old and they all want her to live there. And the previous tenant was a woman who murdered all 4 of her children in the bathtub. So
it's got something. This chapter it's got something for everyone. I jest, but it's one of my favorites. I love this book. Before you launch into it, can you tell us a local bookstore or an indie bookstore that someone might pick up Audrey's Door or some of these books that we've been talking about?
Sure. I love Chevalier Books on Larchmont Avenue in Los Angeles. It's right near my writing space. It's a great place, and it's open now, and you can pre-order anything you want. And LA is in a lockdown right now, but you can pre-order anything you want and pick it up, and they leave it outside. So it's a great place.
Fantastic. So with that, let's hear a bit from Audrey's Door by Sarah Langan. Take it away, Sarah.
Okay. So this is chapter 3, and it's called All the Pretty Young Things in the Dark. Okay. She keyed herself into 14B and put down her suitcase. The ceilings were even higher than she'd remembered, and the 50-foot hall was more cavernous. She pictured herself waking up at night and getting lost, so she took a deep breath and reminded herself that big was good. Carrying her cactus, she walked down the hall and opened doors one after the next. First, the small bedroom, a child's room, she guessed, where the drowned ones had slept. After signing the lease, she'd been foolish and had researched Clara DeLay, a divorced has-been opera diva, worse than a has-been and almost been, big, beautiful, and full of temper. Her drinking got the better of her, and city opera fired her. The low point in her life transformed her. She checked into rehab and became a new, more generous woman. A few months after her release, she met and married her lawyer husband at Betty Ford. They had 4 dewy-eyed kids, aged 10, 8, 5, and 2. Their life was suburban perfection, a picket fence, good schools, nice neighbors, a short commute to the city. They grew apart. The divorce got ugly. She accused him of cheating. He accused her of beating the children and giving the infant brain damage. At 2 years of age, Deirdre Caputo had still not spoken a single word. Her eyes, which had once focused on objects dangling in front of her, mobiles, human faces, her own fingers, became glazed. When the change in her behavior was proven in court, and her concussions linked to the dull handle of a metal spatula, Richard wound up with custody. Clara had only lived in 14B for 15 days before the tragedy. But in that short time, she'd managed to start drinking after more than a decade of sobriety. The Daily News posted one of the last family photos of the Caputo DeLay family in its online archive. The father was absent, possibly because he'd snapped the picture. The kids, dressed in red and green finery, had stood next to the fake white Christmas tree. Eldest Keith had cradled glassy-eyed Deirdre in his arms. The child's gaze had been eerily vacant, her pupils so dilated they'd appeared black. Beside them had been the second oldest, Olivia, with her hands fixed on toddler Kurt's shoulders. They'd formed their own family while several feet behind them, Clara DeLay had worked. She'd grown sloppy and obese, wearing black, horn-rimmed glasses and blue sweats. Normally, Audrey would have wondered about Clara, whether the woman had suffered, was sick in the head, had some kind of reason for what she'd done. But looking at this miserable, lurking thing that had glowered behind those 4 innocents, all she'd seen was a monster. Now, Audrey's eyes adjusted to the bright October light as it shone across the freshly glazed pine planks in the children's room. She didn't like to court these morbid thoughts, but unanswered questions tended to nag her into insomnia. So she imagined the room's many possible configurations. Then she nodded and pictured the one that fit best. The baby hadn't lived here, but in a crib with Clara in the master bedroom. In this room, there had been a bunk bed against the wall for the boys and a single bed by the window for the girl. Trunks for clothes, a shared closet, and an aisle of walking space between beds. She even thought she could guess the color, jarring red, because the children would have argued between pink and blue, and Clara, by then, had gone mad. She walked to the center of the room, then lowered her head in prayer, because a tragedy this size demanded acknowledgement. "You poor kids, I'm so sorry," she said. The apartment did not answer her, and nothing creaked in the stagnant bedroom air, so she continued. "I'll change this place and make it warm, but I'll remember you." Her words didn't echo, even though the room was empty. Instead, they seemed to gather inside the walls, as if something there had received them. She bowed her head and left. Across the hall was the renovated bath. The copper fixtures remained, but the antique yellow wall tiles had been ripped in places to make room for the new jacuzzi, Home Depot vanity, and pressed wood cabinets. She closed her eyes and imagined a clawfoot tub, deep enough to stack all 5 of them. After a few hours, the tops of their bodies would have turned pale, and their bottoms would have purpled with jellied blood. Audrey blinked. When that didn't work, she held the cactus steady and tapped her ballet flats 4 times each. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. A slow motion, Fred a stare. The sound was soft and soothing. The hole in her mind from which the image had sprouted closed, and she moved on. The next room was the kitchen. Old built-in cupboards and oak floors. To her relief, the walls smelled like grain and decades of home cooking. The happy opposite of hunger. Finally, the master bedroom. She took a deep breath and opened the door. The chandelier threw rainbow shards of light along the walls. Small details like guilloche molding and the hand-blown mercury glass doorknob made her heart patter. She imagined green velvet curtains and knew exactly where she'd get the 4-poster bed. That antique shop on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn that delivered. She laughed out loud, just thinking about it. She'd sleep till noon. She let out a deep breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She'd chosen right, after all. This place was a dream come true. And, well, if it needed paint and a few wall sconces to brighten the mood and erase a bad history, she was up to it. At last, she marched to the end of the hall and pushed open the final door, the den. A rush of ancient dust, some remnants of the former tenants, sprayed her face. She swallowed fast, and it got inside her. Murder, a man's voice whispered. The hairs on the back of her neck pointed skyward. Instinct took over. She raced like something was chasing her and inspected every corner of the den, the turret, the rotted support beam, and double-doored closet. She looked high and low, felt the plaster with her fingers, ran her hands along wood and glass, sniffed the stagnant, dusty air. Nothing spoke or leaped out from a hiding place. She was quite clearly alone. Murder. Had someone really said such a thing? Or was she just nervous about this move? Perhaps this was one of her bad thoughts, like the black hole that wasn't real. She hoped so. Good God, she didn't want to move again. Just then, someone called to her from the front door. Hey! She jumped. Down the 50-foot hall leaned a skinny, pot-bellied young man wearing Janus Moving Company coveralls. We get you where you want to go, the ad in the phone book had read. Hey, she said back, then walked fast in his direction like the room behind her was on fire. He pointed a clipboard at her. Clipboard. Sign on the X, he told her, and she did. He walked away before she could tell him that actually there'd been a mistake. She was moving to Queens instead. Wherever they could find a for rent sign hanging out the window, that would be her new home. She followed the mover out. There were 4 other apartments along Common Hall, A, C, D, and E. As she glanced out from 14B, each of the other apartment doors slammed shut. It happened in a single synchronistic motion. Blood rushed to Audrey's face, and she wondered, were my neighbors watching me? A few minutes later, all 3 movers returned. From their thick nasal accents, she guessed they hailed from the Bronx. In her mind, she named the first one Boss Guy and the other 2 Hot Guy and improbably gangly Plastic Man Guy. Where do we put this? Boss Guy asked, as the other 2 hauled the Steinway baby grand through the door. Rolled on its side over a dolly, it just fit. That's not mine, she said. Boss Guy shook his head. Nah, the guy at the other apartment told us it was a present. Sweet Sorab, she smiled. His grandmother had given him that Steinway, but he'd never learned to play it. Back at his apartment, Audrey used to sit at the bench and bang out chopsticks or half of Heart and Soul. It's too much, she said under her breath. But the 3 movers heard her and glowered. I don't want to move this again, lady, gangly Plastic Man said. He was sweating so much that the floor around him was damp. It was a warm October day, and this was, after all, the 14th floor. Sorab, the man was a saint. She reached into her pocket and felt something sharp, the ring. Good. She'd never forgive herself if she lost it. Please, where do we put this? Boss Guy asked. She startled. Oh, right, the den. They followed her down the long hall, wheeling the piano on its side. When they got about halfway, the lone bulb dangling from the ceiling hissed, popped, and went out. All the doors were closed and no light crept through their cracks. Everything got dark. "Hold on," she called, feeling her way toward the den with one hand, cradling the cactus with the other. Somebody, maybe gangly guy, yelped like the piano had pinned him to a wall. She thought about those 4 kids and Clara. What if their spirits had never left the breviary? In her mind, a hole opened up in the floor, and Clara's wet hands reached out. "Stop," she scolded herself. "Stop it, stop it, stop it." Then to the movers, "You okay?" "We're fine, fine," someone answered, but it was so dark in here. Was that one of the movers talking, or was there someone else in this apartment? Breathing fast, she ran her hands along either wall as she walked. The hall ended. She slammed her forehead bonk and reeled back. The den door creaked open. A rectangle of midday light shone through the turret and illuminated the hall just enough for her to see the movers' shapes. They blended together with the piano like a single lumbering beast. She found the light and flicked it. Everything got bright. The men blinked like moles. Their faces sagged in this less forgiving light, and she realized they weren't as young as she thought. "Where?" Boss Guy growled. They were sweating. They were pissed. "Oh, right," she said, after she caught her breath. She pointed to the buckle in the middle of the den. "Sorry about the light. You can wheel it right to this hole in the floor. I think somebody had a piano here before, or something heavy at least." All 3 of them chose this moment to roll their eyes at her, like it was her fault that pianos are heavy. Then they wheeled it into the room. After they made 2 more trips, Hot Guy finally spoke. "This place isn't right," he said. He wore a cigarette behind his ear, and a pack of Pall Malls rolled into the short sleeve of his sweat-stained undershirt. "Do you know what I mean?" "What's not right, the piano?" she asked. "Where else should I put it?" He was a good-looking guy, and from the way he posed, cross-legged against a wall, she got the feeling that he was accustomed to the attentions of the fairer sex. "My cousin lived in a place like this," he said. "His dog used to bark all night long at the fireplace, like it saw something there. Then my cousin saw it too, an old guy's face watching him, all red-eyed and crazy-like. Turned out some guy had been murdered in the house, then buried under the fireplace with some extra bricks. His wife did it. Happened 100 years before, and nobody who lived there after ever noticed anything wrong. Something about my cousin brought it out. Or hey, maybe it was the dog that brought it out." She decided he'd smoked a bowl before reporting to work. Who else but a stoner would say something so stupid to a woman about to spend her first night in a new apartment all by herself? "Did something bad happen here?" he asked. A shelf dropped in her stomach. She thought about 4 children, acknowledged the things she'd been denying. She'd read that Claire DeLay hadn't emptied the tub from one child to the next. At those tender ages, they could not have understood what death meant, had only learned what it looked like as their mother had plunged them underwater, and they'd witnessed its wild-eyed mask on their siblings' rigid faces. Hot Guy pressed his ear against the plaster and listened. Then he ran his piano string-greased hands up and down the walls, as if feeling for a vibration. She thought about tiny fists and pictured the monster, Claire DeLay, crawling across the apartment one night and sneaking up on her children while they slumbered. Her knees would have left an imprint on the old carpet, a slightly darker hue, or she'd pressed the nylon the wrong way. Or worse, maybe like a witch, she'd crawled along the walls and her greasy, bloated body had left snail trails that hadn't been washed clean, but instead painted white. They were coming through that paint now, psychic residue in the form of this mover's dirty paws. Audrey pointed. "You're making a mess." Startled, Hot Guy dropped his hands. His smears were everywhere. Nobody looked angry, just uncomfortable. She tried to think of an explanation. "I'm feeling a little fragile. I just broke up with my boyfriend. Of course it's haunted. A woman slaughtered her 4 children here." Hot Guy looked like he was going to say something, but the boss interrupted him. "Look what you did to the nice lady's wall, you mucker. Go get a rag." When they were done, she handed them each a $10 tip. "Don't listen to these numbskulls," Boss Guy said, pointing his thumbs at his accomplices. He waited until Audrey cracked a smile and then added, "You know the magic formula, don't you, sweetheart? If you want to be happy here, you will." "Thanks. I'll make sure to tap my ruby slippers," she said, regretting her rudeness even as she spoke. Boss guy raised a puzzled eyebrow. "Oh, yeah," he said, and left without another word. It didn't occur to her until after they were gone that when she'd first arrived, she'd opened all the doors along the hall. But when the bulb went out, they'd all been closed. So who'd closed them?
All right. Fantastic. Fantastic. That was a chapter from
Great
Audrey's
reading.
Door by Sarah Langan. So, forgive the echo. I'm hearing a little echo again, but we're getting ready to wrap up. It's the last few minutes of the show. Before I say a couple of closing remarks, if Lee, Doug, and Sarah, the broadcast is going to end after our closing video, if you wouldn't mind just staying in the backstage, staying in the studio just for a minute or two afterwards. I want to say thanks to the three of you for the great conversation and for the fantastic stories. I really hope to see the three of you in 2021. See you back here next year, hopefully, but also just hope to see you all as well. Everybody, come back and join us this Monday, December 14th. Our guests will be Michelle Garza, Joe Kaplan, David Surface, and Pat Well. Hope to see you there. Please come back on January 14th for Nighttime Logic with Sarah Langan. We'll be talking about her new novel, Good Neighbors. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, stay inspired, have a good night. And we're just going to run the closing video. Thank you so much, everybody.